Recording again. Okay, so this is part 3 of the High Output Management Book Club we've been running. This part is described as Team of Teams. So a large part of it is about organizational structure. Just a quick administrative note as well. We always clash with the group conversation. Today we clash with an engineering group conversation, and most of the people on this call today are in engineering. So if you want to join that, go ahead. I will be around for the full call. So yeah, do whatever you want, basically. But if you do want to talk about something and you are planning to attend the engineering group conversation in 30 minutes, please make sure you get your point up ahead in that the first 30 minutes. So yeah, this section of the book, the first chapter I mostly found as table setting, and then the second 2 chapters were, I put a bunch of notes in the doc, but we don't need to talk specifically about the notes, were around organizational structure, specifically whether you're mission oriented or functional. And then the book says that most organizations end up as or all large organizations with a common business purpose end up in a hybrid organizational form. And then the chapter following that is about how you manage that with a matrix structure, which we explicitly try not to have. Did anything jump out to anybody from those? Oh.
Well, I was just about to say, it was really interesting that they said that all organizations end up in that sort of hybrid structure. And I mean, obviously, Andrew Grove, who wrote the book, has clearly been witness to quite a lot of organizations. So it was just an interesting observation that he had made. But the thing that really stuck out to me the most of everything that came across in this chapter was that that dual management, or having 2 people manage an individual, can actually work if they are if it's very clear who is responsible for what aspect of that person's job. Because it's something that I've always struggled with. How would you deal with 2 managers if you've got 2 people telling you completely different things? Eventually people are just going to get super frustrated and leave. And it was just nice to actually see him lay it out so clearly and say, well, it can work if you do this. And in hindsight, that seems completely obvious. Yes, you just give them different pieces of that person's time to be responsible for. And I thought that was a really valuable thing to call out, because I think even in the type of work that we do, there do seem to be different people who are responsible for different aspects of what you do. So I thought that was a really useful thing to call out that they did, or that he did.
Yeah, I've also not worked at a place where I feel like that hybrid structure is the dual manager structure has actually worked. But that doesn't mean it can't work. That just means I haven't worked at Intel or whatever. Craig, were you going to say something there?
Yeah, I was going to say something similar. I think in software especially, there's so much overlap that you can't have those completely separate roles that were outlined in the book that makes the separation of duties clear and managing lines clear, even when you have dual reporting. So I think the most common scenario for us in software, and sorry, Leslie, I'm kind of excluding you on this one a bit, is the QA engineering reporting, right? Often as an engineering manager, you have QA folks reporting up to you, and while the goals are similar, often the way we go about it can be separate and different. And I think that's where most of the common dual reporting structure can come into conflict for me, at least historically.
Yeah, I think the example given in the book, if I remember rightly, I read it, full disclosure, I read this section of the book yesterday evening, so I should remember it. But I think one of the examples given was a security manager at a specific facility where you want the security organization to be consistent across the company as a whole, but because they're in different places, it makes sense to have someone manage that person on site who makes. And the book gives fairly prosaic examples, making sure they turn up and stuff like that.
Yeah, when I worked at Siemens, we had geo reporting structures, but then also global reporting structures. And so the US, we're recording this, so it didn't really work that great. Because you ended up adding a bunch of margin to and a lot of time with decision making. And I mean, from my role within field marketing, I report into marketing, but work very closely with sales. And so having the sales and marketing alignment really tight within this organization has really helped that go smoothly. So, you know, hopefully we're not going to ever get to a point where I'm not having a conversation where it's not smooth, but I kind of am it's not exact matrix and dual reporting, but I guess sales is my customer, but it's just, you know, maybe a little bit more so than what y'all have from an engineering standpoint.
Yeah, well, no, that's really interesting, because the part that resonated like really with me there was the two plane organizations, where it talks about someone having these different responsibilities within different contexts. So for instance, I can't remember the example given in the book, but within this call, for instance, like Dahlia is senior to Rachel and I, but within this call, Rachel and I are running the call. Like, that's a simple example, but that's sort of a basic explanation of how it works. So does that sort of feel like how it works for you with sales and marketing, where you have this position within the marketing structure, but then you also have this position within this other plane, which is related to sales and how you do the field marketing for these events?
Yeah.
Cool. Dahlia, did you want to talk about the Spotify model that they've been doing?
Yeah, I just wanted, I think most might be familiar with this, but when I was reading the section 1, I also had not had a great experience with dual management. I think the biggest gap was always who is focused on the career development of the individual. So with this, you know, multiple manager responsibility. But to get back to the point here, I just put a link to the Spotify model. It is sort of a new way or a new attempt to address, you know, individuals who contribute to multiple functions and how you might structure your team. So it's less about, you know, like you would still end up with one people manager that you report to, so not reporting to multiple folks. But when it comes to areas of expertise, you would have, you know, the guild model or the tribe model and so on. I know this is not something that we would do here, but just from what's around in other organizations, that's one of the new models that seem to be sticking.
Yeah. Oh, sorry, go ahead, Craig.
I was going to say, it almost felt like that section of the book switched from how you manage others to how you manage yourself, right? How you deal with being, you know, at some point in time, you're managing direct reports, and then you switch mode to where you're being managed by other folks. It seemed less about how you manage in a matrix environment and more focused on how you are managed in a matrix environment. At least that was kind of my impression while I was reading that.
Yeah, I see that. This is a different book, so I won't go too deep into it, but I read a book called The Manager's Path a while ago, and what I found interesting about that is the first chapter of that is how to be managed before it tells you how to be a manager, because like obviously they are two sides of the same coin, and I think that part also applies here. I think also at GitLab we do have some of these like parallel planes as well. Like, you know, you do have like maintainers, for instance, which are sort of a separate group. We have the way we organize into groups around product stages is kind of similar as well, where, you know, we have a product manager who reports into the product organization, a back-end team who reports into a back-end manager, a front-end team who reports into a front-end manager, and both of those report to the same director of engineering, quality engineer who reports into a quality engineering manager, and a UX product designers, whatever they're called now, who report into a UX manager. So I don't think that's exactly the same, because you're not reporting to people within that other structure, but it's an attempt to solve the same problem, I think.
And also the structures about the, you know, the temporary working group structures as well are also completely separate from that. Like those, what you've described are the almost permanent structures. And then every now and then people from all over the company get thrown together to meet some specific goal for everyone across any department, any level, everything. It's just a whole bunch of people that get together to solve something specific, and then they disband again. And that's completely, again, another plane to operate in.
Yeah, those are working groups at GitLab, is that. the term we use for that. And I think we have a few of those going on.
And another thing that I found interesting with the plane discussion that he put forward in the book was I liked that diagram that he did that showed how the individual was in multiple planes. And I've actually been thinking about how to now use that with the people on my team to show them what their leverage is and how they what their scope of influence is inside of the organization, just asking them to map out who they think they are connected with. And trying to see what types of people are missing and how to make that broader or, fill in the gaps. I'd never thought about it as a graph like that you can actually just write down and fill in. And I like that. That's what I feel I got out of the book. Like that's the one page I got out of this section that's awesome for me.
Yeah, I love the example just to that he used to really make the point there about how this can seem confusing that you have these two planes with different organizational charts, but if you think about it as someone just in a completely different context, like at their church or whatever, they might have a completely different set of responsibilities there, and you can very easily imagine that because you're not the same role in every part of your life, and you might not be the same role in every part of how you work within a company as well. So I thought that was a really great example to just made me think, oh right, yeah, that's so obvious that I don't really see a way to dispute that. Did everybody else feel that these two chapters that I'm talking about went together, or was that just me where we're talking about first of all the organizational structure and then about how the reporting works? Because Craig mentioned the reporting one being more about how you are managed than how you manage people.
I did get the sense that they go together because if you didn't have a hybrid organization, you wouldn't have to really concern yourself too much with the dual reporting structure. If everything was just straight, it would be straight lines all the way to the top, and making it hybrid introduces that sort of certain element of complexity, and then it becomes about, well, how do you correctly report for that? So I think in a sense they were somewhat related.
Yeah, I would agree. I don't know
Yeah,
that I actually thought about it until you brought it up.
It's okay. Like I said, I read these last night, so I was trying to keep track of which notes were from which chapter, and because I was getting confused, that was the main thing that made me think they were related, but that might just be me getting confused.
I have to be honest, I have 10% of the book left according to my Kindle. So is part 3 the end of it? It is, right?
No, part three is not the end. Part 4 is the end. So you're ahead. You're ahead of me for sure.
Yeah, my Kindle Cloud reader is doing the same thing, Leslie. I thought I was almost done too. It just, the percentage never changed.
Oh. Yeah, I think the rest of us have got the dead tree version.
I think I would prefer that. This is my first workbook that I'm reading on a Kindle, and so I find that I take notes on my phone in the notes section so I can access it for this call, and then I highlight on the Kindle. So much like my meeting notes taking, it's all over the place. So this is my, like I said, first book on the Kindle. I think I would prefer the paperback so I can take notes and remember things.
Yeah, no, I find that useful personally as well. So I'm going to jump ahead to the next chapter, but we can also talk about the previous chapters a bit more as well if people want to. So the modes of control. Oh, sorry. The one thing I did mean to mention is reading these chapters. For me personally, as someone who doesn't manage managers but manages individuals, the most interesting part I thought was how these concepts. Obviously, this book is mentioned on our leadership page, but it might not be this book specifically, but rather these concepts in general have informed GitLab's organizational structure. We have a thing on our leadership page, which I linked to there, which explicitly says no matrix organization. It mentions cultural values a lot in the next chapter, and obviously that's a thing that we take very seriously. And it was interesting to me to see how that all mapped out in the context of a company I'm very familiar with because I work there. And Leslie, I've worked in a company before that sort of switched between sort of geo and functional reorgs every 18 months, couple of years, and I don't feel like they ever found the sweet spot, and I don't know because I left. So yeah,
I think they did it just to keep people employed because they had tough employee unions that they had to work with on there.
Right. Well, yeah, that was also an interesting quote that I wrote down as well, was that we should not expect to escape from complexity by playing with reporting arrangements. And I thought the word playing there was quite interesting. Like, obviously, this is important stuff, but you've got to treat it as important stuff. You can't just like play around with it. So yeah, modes of control. I don't know if this is going to work very well on the recording, but I'm going to try it. So there's this diagram, which I really liked, which is on two. So there's a quadrants. It's got. Sorry, that's actually the wrong diagram. That's the wrong quadrants. It's similar quadrants. It's about whether the motivation is coming from self-interest or group interest, and obviously both are needed in an organization. And then what it calls a CUA factor, which is complexity, ambiguity, and uncertainty. So the more well-defined something is, the easier it is to like explain how you align that. Like, you use a contract, you use free market forces. In some cases, it mentioned like the case of buying a tire at the lowest price or whatever. But then in the intersection between self-interest and high complexity, ambiguity, and uncertainty, you have nothing works. And in the intersection between group interest and the high CUA factor, you have cultural values. So I wondered what people thought about how that sort of related to how they use GitLab's values to sort of navigate those situations where it's not really clear like how you should proceed.
Well, I just not necessarily talking about values, but I did very much appreciate the just like nothing works box. There's no nice way of putting something slightly happy in this box. Just like nothing will work here. So I like that.
Yeah, I did too. Like, don't even try it.
I'm trying to click through to find the graph again myself, but I really like it. I've in past companies, well, a past company, whenever we had ambiguity, I tried to pull out the company cultural values, and it was interesting. The company was kind of a downward trend, and early in the days that I was there, we could apply the values and come up with an answer, right? The right direction to go, or at least the perceived right direction to go. And then later on, as the company was in panic mode, no, it was just all about money. How do we just close a sale? We don't need to talk about values right now. So I like to try to bring it back to cultural values when I can, when there's some level of ambiguity. And I think it's a good exercise to put my team through when they're having those discussions.
Do you think that was an inherent thing, that like the more an organization is struggling, the less those values, the less it's able to stick to those values?
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, especially like smaller companies that are really struggling for the next paycheck. They want to meet their quarterly goals to impress the investors, or whatever outside influences there are. Might not necessarily be about money, but if there's something that's really pushing them in a direction that goes away from their values, that's a value in and of itself. Do we stick with our core values and apply those, or do we go with what's the external force that's influencing us right now and throw our values out the window to achieve the short-term goal, which causes long-term pain?
Mm-hmm. And the external force is pretty much always money in this case, I guess, right? Like revenue.
Yeah. Money, board pressure. Yeah.
Yeah, I think it's especially common in startups, right? Because it's easy in the early days to be very idealistic, and then it's hard to like map that. There's obviously examples in the news about places where maybe the company culture hasn't survived a change at executive level, for instance.
Yeah, absolutely.
I have enjoyed throughout the book how he keeps talking about values. And also, we landed up putting the values just at the bottom of the section because I realized that he talks so much about values, but we didn't actually know what Intel's values were. But I have really appreciated how much he talks about it and how intrinsic he feels that those values are to how successful the organization is. And having worked for an organization where the values are so important, what they really give you is a way of figuring out how people will behave in certain circumstances, because they will always operate according to the values. And that means that certain things become more predictable because you can almost anticipate it if you evaluate it against that set of values. And what I'm enjoying about GitLab is it feels like the values are holding as we grow and are getting more voice to them also as we grow. I think that's part of what the leadership is trying to do, is just instill the values over and over and over again. And I think that also helps when you talk about your reporting or you talk about hybrid organizations, because you can almost hope that people will behave according to those values regardless of where they sit in that structure.
Yeah, that part reminded me of the book Tribal Leadership, and GitLab is the same way too, right? It's more of a, while the values typically come from top down, they are held tightly by everybody, right? And if someone within the tribe in this case is not living up to the values, everybody holds them accountable, instead of it's just being top down, well, we all will all act this way. So I agree. I think it's great that it's so pervasive within the GitLab culture.
Leslie, do you want to go ahead?
Yeah, I was just going to say, for this section, I kept kind of going back between, have you seen the urgent and the important matrix, where it talks about, when things are urgent and when they're important and how people respond. I kind of was thinking about those two charts in my mind, and I will probably use this chart more so as I'm scaling my team. For a while in the US, it was just myself and another field marketing manager, and we've hired 2 people within the last 6 weeks. So I use this section as kind of more of a reminder and food for thought in the future.
Yeah, I think it is really important in hiring, and also I really like that it mentioned that the 2 main ways you get these values across to people are, first of all, like writing them down, like telling people what they are, which is obviously like super important. But the second one is even more important, which is by actually following them, like by doing them. And I think it mentioned earlier in the book about time management, how leading by example is incredibly important. And it also mentions it here because, like Craig said, it becomes sort of reinforcing when everybody's doing the same things and expecting everybody to behave in the same ways. If it's just top down, it won't work as well. Another interesting thing I found here was the comment about promotion from within, where it says it tends to be favored by corporations with strong corporate cultures, because you expect people to, I guess, let me check what it actually said. I think it was about, like, the culture itself is an important part of how the company works. And that's an important aspect of like coming into those positions. And obviously we're growing at a rate where that's not possible for every position. And when we hire people from outside, we really try and hire people who match up to those values. But as we're like doubling in this financial year, like clearly we can't. Promotion doesn't work like for every case, and not everybody wants to or has the aptitude to be promoted into those positions. But it was interesting to me that he sort of called that out specifically as a thing that tied into a strong corporate culture.
Yeah, it's kind of, I agree, but also disagree. I'm being flaky, basically, is what I'm saying. I think it depends on the position. So going back to engineering, I think for the more senior technical roles, I am much more in favor of promotion, right? Because you have the technical skills, the product well. And I've been in companies where they brought in a lot of like principal staff. They didn't bring any distinguisher above, but above senior from the outside, and that really upset those that were trying to get to that level, because it was there was such a barrier to entry for that position, and it wasn't well defined. So it caused some discord within the company. And often, like in management role, there may be some that have the ability, but very few pure engineers have the desire to be managers. So you often have to go outside to find managers that can do the job well. And I think there's a balance to be held there, was the other point I was going to try and make, because often a new manager, a new engineer can bring in new technology, new innovations that, while you're in the mode of your company and doing things the company way, may not necessarily go out and look at, right? Because you have a way of doing things and it's the way you always did things. And often bringing in new folks from the outside can spark some innovation. So I'm in favor of a balance. I don't think that they said promotion from within was the only way, but I think you just need to make some smart choices on the balance there.
Yeah, no, I think that's a very good and nuanced way of putting it. I think especially hiring the senior technical staff can be difficult for them as well, because it's a difficult position to come into, where you're expected to sort of exhibit that sort of leadership, but in a, I guess what the book calls a know-how manager position rather than a people manager position, where you have less sort of contractually defined stuff. This is what like I do as part of my role where I lead people, and more of like, you know, I need to get people to follow me. How do you feel like the hiring's gone, Dahlia? Like, as you've been here a while and had to hire people into a bunch of different positions.
I definitely like go back to the values when I look at candidates, especially, you know, as we're hiring so much and we have aggressive targets. It's been really refreshing, especially hearing Eric say, focus on the quality. Like we can justify not meeting our targets, but we can't justify bringing someone who's, you know, not aligned, or we don't, you know, we've compromised on our standards there. But it is something I've been thinking about very, very much lately. As I look across, I mean, I'm looking more toward engineering, but there are way more new folks than folks who've been here before I joined. And that's quite, you know, quite interesting, because I've come to really enjoy the company, the culture, the way it's, you know, it's set up, and I would love to see that scale. But as you bring on new folks, especially at higher levels, managers and above, it is interesting, not to fault them, but we all come with different cultural and different backgrounds. Sorry,
Yeah.
Sean, does that answer your question?
No, that really does. Yeah, because obviously, you know, we've got a range of, I guess, 10 years at GitLab. Rachel was saying to me that she still feels like she's new at GitLab, and it's like, well, half the company has joined since you started. So
Exactly.
I don't know how new you are. Leslie, yeah, I mean, you mentioned sort of scaling out your team. Is that something you've been doing sort of actively so far? How's that worked out when you've been doing that?
I mean, the biggest thing that we've had to deal with was around, you know, pay. And so, you know, they appear to be a good cultural fit. They know how to do the job, but can you meet the payment requests? So that's just been my,
That's the bigger challenge.
Yeah.
There was a sort of unrelated, or slightly related anecdote at the end of that chapter about like how they were missing a bunch of targets at Intel for a while, and the salespeople were all, you know, missing their commission, not because of their fault, because like engineering or whatever wasn't delivering, and they stayed with Intel anyway, which he puts down to sort of trust that the system works as well. I'm not sure. I don't have the context there. I'm not sure like how much you can attribute to that, but I guess it's easier to get people to stay than convince them to join.
I mean, I think it just depends on the person. So I don't remember, what was that in modes of control? I'm getting my section confused.
Yeah, it was in modes of control. I think it was right at the end. He's talking about at one time, one of our divisions had serious problems leaving the sales engineers with no product to sell for nearly a year. They could have left Intel and immediately got another jobs and quick commissions elsewhere, but by and large, they stayed with us. They stayed because they believed in the company and had faith that eventually things would get better. Belief and faith are not aspects of the market mode, but stem from adherence to cultural values. So, yeah, harder to sell that from the outside, though. Okay, so Craig and Rachel have left, so that leaves 3 of us. Did anybody else have anything that sort of jumped out to them from this section?
I really liked the next section a lot better. I'll be honest, this section was kind of like hard for me to get through. Part of it was because I think I've heard these things before, and I also, this style of a book, I do much better when it's like a novel format. Like I love the Phoenix Project. So just this style is just different. It's just not as easy for me to get into it and like absorb and soak up all the information.
Yeah. For me, I was talking about this with Rachel earlier because we do a quick prep call before each one just to make sure that we're both sort of on the same page and that we're both ready to step in if nobody's wanting to say something. Basically. And I mentioned that for me personally, like the first section of this book has been the section where I've been most like, oh, I should do that, like totally do that. And this section, even if I had felt that, like I couldn't really do that because I don't manage managers, like I manage like individual contributors. So like my power to like restructure anything is like 0 basically. So for me personally, like it's less directly applicable than it would be for somebody like Dahlia. I guess.
So I have a lot more to add in the next.
Yeah, I mean, I found it reassuring when he was talking about the hybrid model, because that's one of the things I really enjoy is coming into a startup and help mature an engineering team. Like I have a lot of passion for that phase. So it was assuring to see that yes, this hybrid model is somewhat necessary. And in all fairness, I've seen it across most organizations. I'm trying to think of one that didn't have it. So that was good. I did struggle with the, to do a reporting. I really like that we have the no matrix management. And that's been more successful in my experience. So that was the other thing that I related to, but not in the way he was presenting it.
Yeah, it was quite funny coming at that from a sort of GitLab context where we're like, no, we really don't want to do that. But he's like, you can totally do this, it's fine. Yeah, well, that's good about the next section as well. Yes, the next section is longer, so obviously bear that in mind when reading, although Leslie's ahead, Rachel's ahead, I'm not ahead. It's also the last call. I think I'm going to set up a survey in Culture Amp somehow, speak to People Ops as well after that, but if people could think about like what we could do better in the future with book clubs and what they liked about this book club, that would also be useful. And I'll see you all in 2 weeks.
Great. Thanks so much, Sean and Rachel, who might see the recording. Bye.
Yes. Bye.